This is my true story. I spent my life raising a boy who wasn't mine by blood, but was mine in every other way. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, and built a life around his laughter. I thought love was enough to make me his father. But one evening, at the dinner table, he looked at me with cold eyes and said words that cut deeper than any knife. In that moment, I realized I had been raising a stranger. What he didn't know what I am going to do next. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe so more people hear my story. From the day he could barely stand, I was there. When he took his first steps, it was my hands he reached for. When he cried through fevered nights, it was my shoulder he clung to. His real father had disappeared before he could even form the word Dad. I never asked where or why. I simply stepped into the empty space and filled it. I worked in the rain, through sickness, through winters that bit at my bones, because love, I believed, was built from showing up, not from sharing blood. Every school uniform, every book, every scraped knee was patched, paid for, or soothed by me. I remember sitting outside the principal's office after his fights, listening to teachers say, "He's lucky to have you." I'd nod quietly, proud but tired. He would walk out angry, embarrassed, but I always put a hand on his shoulder and said, "It's all right. We'll fix it." He never called me stepfather, not once. He called me Dad. And each time, that word made all the work, all the sacrifice, feel like purpose. I watched him grow into a man. I taught him how to shave, how to drive, how to speak with kindness, even when life wasn't fair. We weren't perfect. We argued, we clashed, we forgave. But I never imagined a time when my love for him would feel like a mistake. I thought what we built together would last a lifetime. That when I was old and weak, he'd be there to steady me the way I steadied him. When his mother died, the bond between us became the only thing that kept me breathing. We sat side by side at her funeral, my hand on his back while he cried into his palms. That day, I thought we'd become more than father and son. I thought we were the only family left who understood the same pain. Years went by. He found work, bought clothes finer than mine, and spoke with confidence that came from the home I had given him. I watched from the corner, proud. I let him take the best room, the biggest plate, the last bit of warmth from every fire. I told myself that's what fathers do. They give until there's nothing left to give. And I gave. I gave my time, my money, my health. I gave every dream I once had, so he could live without fear. I thought he saw it. I thought he felt it. I thought every sacrifice was another brick in the wall of love we built. But as he grew older, something changed. The gratitude began to fade. The thanks turned to sighs, the sighs to silence. He started calling me by my name instead of Dad. Small things at first. A slip here, a cold glance there. I ignored it. I told myself he was just growing up, learning independence. But deep down, I knew. Distance had begun to creep in. Slow, invisible, merciless. Still, I stayed. Through his arrogance, through his pride, through every moment I felt unseen. I stayed because love doesn't walk away. Because I believed that one day he'd look back and realize what I had done for him, that the man he became was built on the back of another man's sacrifice. I never imagined that all the years of love, labor, and loyalty would one day vanish with a single sentence. It happened on an ordinary evening. No storm, no argument, no warning, just the sound of forks against plates and the low hum of the television in the next room. I had cooked his favorite meal, something I hadn't done in a while because my hands ached and my knees no longer obeyed like they used to. He came home late, smelling of expensive cologne and exhaustion, and sat down across from me without a word. I smiled anyway. I asked about his day, about work, about life. He answered with short nods, his eyes glued to his phone. I didn't mind. I was used to silence between us now. But then he looked up, just for a moment. His eyes were sharp, cold, detached. The kind of eyes that once looked at me with trust now carried a stranger's weight. He put down his fork, leaned back in his chair, and said it. Not in anger, not in shouting. just in a tone so calm that it almost sounded rehearsed. "You're not my real father." And just like that, everything I had built in 25 years cracked. The words didn't echo. They just landed heavy, like a door slamming quietly but permanently shut. I sat there, frozen. My hand trembled against the table. The food, still warm, tasted like ash in the air. I couldn't speak. I didn't even try. There are some moments in life where silence screams louder than anything else. He went back to eating, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just erased decades of sacrifice, as if the man sitting across from him wasn't the one who had held his fevered body as a child, who had worked 2 jobs so he could wear new shoes to school, who had stood by his hospital bed when pneumonia had nearly taken him. I wanted to believe he didn't mean it, that maybe the words slipped out carelessly, the way youth often tosses daggers it doesn't understand. But when he looked at me again, there was no trace of accident, only distance. I stared at his face and saw not my son, but a man who had outgrown gratitude, a man who looked at me not as the father who raised him, but as an inconvenience, a reminder of something he wanted to forget. The clock ticked slowly. The air in the room turned thick. My chest felt heavy, as if every breath carried the weight of betrayal. I tried to remember all the good moments, his first bicycle, the nights I read him stories, the time he hugged me after graduation. But each memory now played like a lie. A cruel trick memory plays when love turns to indifference. He stood up before finishing his meal, dropped his napkin on the plate, and walked away. The sound of his footsteps down the hallway felt like thunder inside my heart. I stayed seated for a long time, staring at the empty chair he had left behind. That chair had once been the center of my world. Now it was just wood and silence. The house felt colder that night. I sat there long after the lights dimmed, my hand still resting where his plate had been. I didn't cry. The tears wouldn't come. There's a kind of pain that goes deeper than crying, a hollow ache that sits behind your ribs and breathes with you. That's what it felt like. For the first time in my life, I understood what it means to love someone who has stopped remembering you. He didn't look back as he left the room, and I didn't stop him. Because I knew something had ended. Not just the dinner, not just the evening. Something inside both of us. The house was silent after he left, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comes from peace. It was the silence that follows an earthquake, still, but full of cracks. I sat alone at the table long after midnight, staring at the cold food and the chair that would never feel the same again. His words played again and again in my head, each repetition cutting a little deeper. "You're not my real father." Simple words, but sharp enough to slice through years of memories, through decades of sacrifice. I thought about everything I had done for him, not to boast, but to understand how love could turn into this kind of emptiness. I remembered the small apartment where we started, the nights when we had no electricity, and I lit candles so he could finish his homework. I remembered fixing his bicycle when I had no money for parts, mending his clothes with thread pulled from my own. I remembered carrying him on my back through rain when his legs were too tired to walk. Each memory, once warm, now burned like proof of my own foolishness. It was strange how fast a single sentence could change everything you believe about yourself. For years, I told myself I was his father, not by blood, but by choice. And choice, I thought, was stronger than DNA. But that night, I learned that love without respect is like building a home on sand. It looks solid until the tide comes. I walked through the house, touching the walls, the pictures, the little things that made it ours. Every photo smiled back at me with lies. In one, he was a child sitting on my shoulders, his hands gripping my hair, both of us laughing. I stared at that photograph until my eyes stung. I realized that the laughter had belonged to the boy, not the man who now sat across from me at dinner. Somewhere along the way, my son had disappeared, replaced by someone colder, someone who saw me as an obligation. That realization hurt more than the words, because the truth wasn't that I had lost him that night. It was that I had already been losing him for years, piece by piece, without noticing. His visits had become shorter, his tone sharper, his affection quieter. I had mistaken distance for maturity, silence for independence. I didn't see it for what it was, the slow retreat of love. As I walked through his room, I noticed how little of me existed there anymore. New clothes, expensive gadgets, travel souvenirs, but none of the old things I had given him. The carved wooden frame I made for his graduation photo was gone. The books I had given him sat untouched. Even the old watch that once belonged to his mother, the one I kept safe until he was old enough, lay forgotten in a drawer. I sat on the edge of his bed, my hands resting on the blanket I'd folded 1,000 times before. It was still warm, faintly carrying his scent, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a museum of someone else's life, one where I was just a visitor who'd stayed too long. That night, something inside me quietly shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't make noise, but changes everything forever. I realized that love, when given to the wrong heart, becomes a slow form of grief. I realized I had been holding on to a version of him that no longer existed, and I realized that I had been living in a story where I was the only one still reading. I stood up and looked at myself in the mirror. The face staring back was older, heavier, but calm. There was no anger, just exhaustion. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies. I just wanted peace. And peace, I knew, would never live under the same roof as betrayal. That was the night I stopped being his father. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I finally understood that he had stopped needing one. That night I did not sleep. The bed felt too large, the room too heavy. Every time I closed my eyes, the words came back, not shouted, not cruelly thrown, just calmly spoken like a verdict I could not appeal. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting the slow beats of my heart, listening to the ticking clock on the wall, wondering how a house so full of memories could suddenly feel so empty. The moonlight crept through the curtains, silver and cold, painting everything in quiet honesty. It showed me what I didn't want to admit, that the love I had carried for so long had nowhere left to go. I turned over, hoping for rest, but every shadow reminded me of him. The corner of the room where I used to place his school bag, the spot on the wall where his drawings once hung, the chair where I'd sat waiting through his teenage tantrums, the silence afterward always louder than the argument itself. For years, I'd convinced myself that silence meant forgiveness. Now I knew it had only meant distance. I thought of his childhood, the scraped knees, the broken toys, the laughter echoing down hallways we could barely afford. I thought of the way he'd hold my hand crossing the road, how his little fingers used to grip mine as if letting go would mean losing the world. I thought of the nights he'd fall asleep on my chest, and I'd stay awake listening to his breathing, afraid that if I closed my eyes, life might steal the sound away. Those memories used to bring warmth. That night, they only brought ache. I sat up before dawn and looked around the room I had once called home. The photos on the dresser seemed like ghosts from another time. In one, we were standing by the lake, both smiling. I remembered that day clearly. He'd just learned to swim, and I'd never been prouder. But now, staring at that picture, I realized how foolish I'd been. I had built my whole purpose around someone else's life, someone who could erase me with a single sentence. The night stretched endlessly. I made tea I didn't drink. I opened drawers I didn't need to. I even packed a small bag halfway, just to see how it would feel. It felt strange, freeing, terrifying. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine leaving, not in anger, but in quiet withdrawal. I imagined what it would be like to live without waiting for someone to say, "Thank you." To wake up in a place where every room wasn't a reminder of what I'd lost. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. The body moved slower than the heart, and mine still beat with confusion. I asked myself what I had done wrong, where the line had blurred between father and stranger. I thought of his real father, a man who had vanished long before responsibility arrived, and I wondered if maybe, in his absence, I had been pretending too hard to fill a void that was never mine to fill. Still, I couldn't bring myself to hate him. Hatred takes energy, and I had none left to give. All I felt was an ache so deep it numbed me. Love had turned to habit, habit to duty, and duty to emptiness. And in that emptiness, something small but powerful began to form. Clarity. By the time the first light of morning broke through the window, I had stopped questioning and started accepting. His words could not be taken back, and I could not return to being the same man who once called this place home. The ache would stay for a while, but grief, like everything else, passes. I knew now what I had to do. I looked out at the rising sun and realized that sometimes the only way to be seen again is to disappear. By morning, something inside me had changed. The ache was still there, but it no longer ruled me. It had turned into a kind of stillness, the kind that comes when pain finally runs out of ways to speak. I walked to the window and looked at the faint light spreading across the sky, slow, gentle, uncaring. It struck me how the world keeps moving no matter who breaks, no matter whose heart stops beating the same way. Life doesn't pause for anyone. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me calm, because now I knew what had to happen next. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too small for what I felt. I was simply finished. Finished pretending to belong where I was no longer wanted. Finished trying to fix something that had chosen to stay broken. For 25 years, I had been a father in every way that mattered, except the one he now decided counted: blood. So I decided to let him have what he wanted. If I wasn't his real father, then he didn't need my real sacrifices either. The house was quiet as I walked through it. The air felt different, lighter, as if it already knew I was leaving. The furniture I had built, the walls I had painted, the garden I had tended, they no longer looked like mine. They looked like artifacts of a life that had already ended. Each corner held a memory that used to give me pride, but now only whispered, "It's time." I went to my study and opened the drawer where I kept the papers, titles, deeds, account books, all the little threads that tied this family together. My name was on every one of them. Every roof he lived under, every car he drove, every comfort he enjoyed, all had been paid for by the same hands he now denied. Hands cracked from work, hands that once lifted him from the ground when he fell, hands he now pretended never belonged to him. I realized something as I looked at those papers. All those years, I thought love meant holding on. But sometimes love means letting go in silence, letting life teach what words can't. I didn't need revenge, I needed distance, so I made my decision. I would sell the house, the one he thought was his by inheritance, the one he assumed would always be waiting for him. It wasn't out of spite. It was simply an ending written in ink instead of anger. Once the house was gone, there would be no reason left for me to stay. I packed slowly, not like a man running away, but like one finally moving on. A suitcase, a few shirts, the photo of his mother. Her smile was the only thing that could still stop my heart for a second. She had warned me once, years ago, that love can blind as easily as it heals. I hadn't understood then. Now I did. I called my lawyer before noon. His voice was hesitant when he heard my request. "Are you sure you want to sell?" he asked. I simply said yes. There was no explanation needed. Some decisions don't come from thought, they come from truth. After that call, I felt a strange peace settle over me. The pain didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It became light enough to carry. I spent the rest of the day in quiet. I walked through the house one last time, touching the door frames, the windows, the places that once echoed with laughter. I thought of how life repeats. We build, we lose, we learn, and we walk away. By sunset, I sat on the porch, watching the sky burn orange, and I whispered something I hadn't said in years. Thank you. Not to him, but to the lesson. Because even heartbreak can teach you how to be free. The decision was made, and I would not look back. The next morning, I woke with purpose for the first time in years. The heaviness I had carried for so long was still there, but now it felt like armor, not a wound. I dressed slowly, old shirt, pressed trousers, polished shoes, the kind of dignity I refused to let grief steal. There was something poetic about ending this chapter properly, not in anger, but in precision. I took a deep breath, gathered the documents from my desk, and stepped outside. The air was cool and bright, and for the first time, I didn't look back at the house. I simply walked forward. The lawyer's office was quiet, almost too quiet. The walls smelled faintly of old wood and paper, and the ticking clock above the reception desk sounded louder than usual. I sat in the same chair I had once occupied years ago when setting up this home, this future, for him. It felt strange to be there again, not as a father building security, but as a man undoing his own generosity. The lawyer greeted me with polite confusion. He'd known me for years, knew the stories, the family, the endless pride I once carried. "You're sure you want to sell it?" he asked again, scanning my face for hesitation. There was none. He placed the documents before me, the same ones that once symbolized safety, stability, and love. I looked at the line with my name on it, the name that had been mocked, forgotten, and replaced in my own home, and smiled faintly. Then I picked up the pen. It's funny how something so small, a pen, can hold the power to change everything. I'd held wrenches, hammers, and planks of wood all my life, building homes, fixing things that were broken. But that morning, the only tool I needed was ink. One signature, steady and sure, turned years of sacrifice into a clean slate. As the pen moved across the paper, I felt no regret, no hesitation, just release. When I finished signing, I sat back and watched as the lawyer gathered the papers, stamping them, sealing them, making it all official. The house, the laughter, the walls, the life I built, now belonged to someone else. The irony was sharp but beautiful. The home I once gave in love would now be gone in silence. I didn't ask who the buyer was. It didn't matter. All I wanted was for it to be final, for that chapter to close without a sound. The lawyer looked at me once more, perhaps hoping I'd change my mind. I thanked him for his help, shook his hand, and stood. My voice was steady, calm, almost cold. "It's done," I said. And it was. Outside, the sun felt different on my skin, not warmer, but freer. I walked slowly down the street, past the shops, the trees, the same old cafe where I'd once taken him for ice cream when he was a boy. I stopped for a moment, remembering how he used to laugh with his mouth full, how he'd insist on paying with coins I'd given him. That memory could have broken me again. But instead, it reminded me that I had done enough. I had given enough. And now I could take back what was left. My peace. Back home, I spent the evening quietly. There was no celebration, no drink, no music, just stillness. I packed a few final belongings, a photograph, a coat, a small notebook filled with old memories I'd never read again. Each fold, each item, felt like the closing of a door. When I finished, I placed the pen, the same one that had ended it all, on the table. A small, ordinary object, yet it had done what years of begging and pain couldn't. It had freed me. That night, I slept better than I had in decades. Not because the hurt was gone, but because I had finally acted on it. The decision was no longer just a thought. It was written, signed, sealed, and irreversible. He would wake soon to find his world gone, and I would wake in a new one without obligation, without expectation, without betrayal. The morning he returned home was the first morning in years that I felt no weight in my chest. The sale was complete. The ink had dried. Everything that tied me to that house, to that life, was finished. I woke before dawn, the air still and gray, and watched the world slowly come alive outside my window. Somewhere across town, the papers were being processed, the deeds already reassigned, the locks ready to change hands. By the time he walked through that front door, everything he thought belonged to him would belong to someone else. I didn't stay to watch. I couldn't. Some endings are cleaner when unseen, but I knew exactly how it would unfold. I could picture it as clearly as if I were standing there myself. He would arrive late morning, keys in hand, maybe humming, maybe half distracted by his phone. He'd push open the door expecting the familiar sound of home, the smell of coffee, the soft echo of comfort he never earned. Instead, he'd hear voices, not mine, strangers. Real estate agents walking through the hallways, their footsteps measured, professional, detached. A woman's voice saying, "This room gets excellent light in the mornings," another man noting, "We can have the movers in by Friday." His confusion would come first. A brief pause, a tilt of the head, a laugh of disbelief. He'd assume there was a mistake. Then he'd see the boxes, the tape, the small red tags on furniture that once belonged to him. The papers on the counter stamped and signed, the walls stripped of every trace of our life together. The panic would set in slowly, then, all at once. He'd search for me, maybe call my name once, twice, but the silence would answer back. The silence would tell him everything. He'd find the empty space where the family photo once hung, the outline still visible on the wall, lighter than the rest. He'd open the bedroom door and see the drawers cleaned, the closet bare, the shelves empty except for the faint smell of old wood and dust. In that moment, he'd finally understand what absence feels like. I imagine he tried calling me. I didn't check. My phone stayed off, tucked away in my jacket pocket as I sat miles away at a small cafe by the train station. I sipped my coffee slowly, watching the world go by. I didn't need to see his number flash on the screen to know what he was saying. Panic first, then anger. Then the kind of quiet that comes when you realize you've gone too far and there's no road back. I didn't do it to hurt him. I did it to teach him something no parent ever wants to teach: the price of forgetting where you came from. Love is not infinite. It can run out, especially when it's taken for granted long enough. When he finally realized the house was gone, he would search the kitchen, the drawers, maybe hoping for a note. I left none. What was there left to say? He'd erased me with a sentence. I erased my presence with an action. The difference was, mine was permanent. I imagine him standing in that empty living room, the echo of his own voice filling the space that once held mine. The silence would sound strange, hollow, accusing, final. For the first time in his life, he'd feel what I felt that night at the dinner table: abandonment. But this time, it was his turn to face it. The real estate agent would speak softly, apologetically. "I'm sorry, sir. The property was sold last week. Everything's been transferred legally." He would look at her, stunned, and maybe ask who did it. And she would answer with the only truth that mattered: the previous owner. That's all I ever wanted him to remember: who built everything he stood on. While he stood there drowning in realization, I boarded a train headed toward the coast. The world outside the window was wide and bright, stretching far beyond the reach of his words. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just watched the tracks blur and thought how strange freedom feels after years of obligation. The home he lost wasn't punishment. It was reflection. He had thrown away a father made of love, and in return, lost a house made of walls. I left before the world could notice. No farewell, no explanation, no trail to follow. Just a man and a suitcase walking out of a life that no longer belonged to him. The airport was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet that feels like permission. I didn't rush. I didn't hide. I simply moved as though I was being carried by something invisible. Not revenge, not triumph, but release. My flight wasn't planned far in advance. I had bought the ticket the night before, one way, no return. I didn't even choose the destination for its beauty or distance, only for its silence. A small country where no one knew my name, where my history couldn't follow. As the plane taxied down the runway, I looked out the window and saw the city shrinking beneath me, every memory turning smaller until it finally disappeared. The ache in my chest lightened with every mile between us. Somewhere below, my son was probably still standing in that empty house, shouting questions that had no answers. Maybe he was pacing, blaming, calling lawyers, replaying every conversation we'd ever had. But none of that mattered anymore. The moment I left, the story of us stopped belonging to him. It was mine again. When the plane broke through the clouds, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not joy. Not victory. Just peace. The kind that comes when a man finally stops explaining himself to those who never listened. The airport at my destination was small, almost forgotten. The air smelled of sea salt and rain. I walked through the gates, carrying everything I owned, a bag of clothes, some savings, and an old photograph of his mother. I found a taxi and gave the driver the name of a village I had seen once in a magazine decades ago. He nodded silently and drove. The road twisted along the coast, cliffs on one side, endless water on the other. Waves crashed below, steady and timeless. I watched them and thought of all the years I had spent trying to hold still what was meant to move. Love, loyalty, even family. Nothing stays if you keep gripping too tightly. It either suffocates or escapes. I had finally learned to let go. When the taxi stopped, I stepped out onto a quiet road lined with olive trees. A small inn sat at the edge of the sea. The woman who owned it smiled when I asked if there was a room. She didn't ask my story. She didn't ask where I came from. She just handed me a key. It was the kind of kindness that doesn't pry, the kind I had long forgotten existed. My room was small, with white walls and a single window overlooking the water. I unpacked my bag, folded my clothes neatly, and placed the photograph of his mother on the nightstand. For a long time, I just stood there, staring out at the horizon. It was endless, open, and quiet. Exactly what I needed. Days turned into weeks, and the noise of my old life faded like distant thunder. No more phones, no more arguments, no more reminders of what I wasn't. I started walking every morning along the shoreline, feeling the wet sand beneath my feet, the tide washing over old thoughts. I spoke to no one, answered to no one, and for the first time in decades, I didn't feel responsible for anyone's happiness but my own. At night, I wrote small notes in a journal, not letters, not apologies, just reflections. One evening I wrote, "Sometimes disappearing is the only honest way to live." It felt true. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't check the news. Whatever he said about me after I left, whatever story he told to make sense of my absence, he could have it. The truth belonged to me now. I was gone, not lost, not missing, just finally free. Months passed before I heard anything again. Not because I looked for news, but because silence has a way of carrying whispers when you least expect it. A letter found its way to me, forwarded through an old friend who must have guessed where I'd gone. It wasn't from him, it was from a neighbor, short, simple, factual. My son had fallen apart. The house gone, the money gone, the arrogance gone. What remained was a man learning, too late, what loss really feels like. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and went for a walk by the sea. The wind was sharp that day, pulling at my coat, scattering sand across the shore. I let it sting my face. It reminded me I was still alive. I didn't feel joy at his suffering. I didn't feel revenge. I felt something quieter, the balance of things returning to where they belonged. Some lessons the world refuses to teach until you stop trying to soften them. Word reached me later that he'd tried to undo it. He called lawyers, pleaded with banks, searched for loopholes in documents he'd never read. But ink does not forgive. The signatures held firm, the house had new owners, the accounts were empty, and my name, the name he denied, was gone from his life entirely. For the first time, he had to build something on his own. Maybe that was my last gift to him, the chance to start from nothing, the way I once did. I spent my days in stillness, mornings with coffee and salt air, afternoons with long walks and longer thoughts. Sometimes I'd sit on the rocks by the water and throw pebbles into the sea, watching the ripples fade. That was how I measured time now. Not by clocks, not by calendars, but by the distance between what was and what is. I thought of him less as the months went on. Not out of bitterness, but because the mind eventually grows tired of bleeding for what's gone. Yet every so often, when the sun dipped low and the sea turned gold, I'd catch myself thinking of the boy he once was. The boy who held my hand at the market. The boy who built sandcastles by my side, always asking, "Will it last, Dad?" And I'd always say yes. I had no idea how wrong I'd be. There were moments of doubt, of course. Nights when the wind howled against the windows and loneliness crept in like an old friend I didn't want to see. I'd wonder if leaving had been too cruel. if I'd mistaken pride for justice. But then I'd remember the look in his eyes that night at the dinner table. Cold, dismissive, final. He had already left me long before I walked away. I had simply followed. My neighbors in this small coastal town knew me only as the quiet man from away. They'd nod when we passed, sometimes share bread or wine, but they never asked about the past. That was part of why I'd chosen this place. Here, I was no one's father, no one's provider, no one's disappointment. I was just a man who fed the stray cats and watched the sea. That anonymity was its own kind of grace. One evening, while the waves whispered against the shore, I realized something that startled me. I no longer felt sad, not happy, just whole. The grief had become part of me, like a scar that no longer hurt when touched. It reminded me that love, even when lost, still proves you lived fully. I never wrote him back. There was nothing left to explain. If he ever wanted to find me, he could. But if he didn't, I would be fine with that too. Sometimes the best way to love someone who's forgotten you is to let them learn what absence feels like. And so, I stayed by the sea, content with the life I had left. Not rich, not loved, but peaceful, which is more than I ever asked for. Years have passed since that night, the night a sentence ended a lifetime. I no longer remember the exact tone of his voice, only the way the air felt after. Heavy, still, unforgiving. Time has softened the edges of my anger, but not the truth behind it. Some wounds don't heal. They simply stop bleeding. I don't live in bitterness, only distance. Distance has become my sanctuary, the quiet space between what I gave and what I lost. I live by the rhythm of small things now, the sound of waves pulling at the shore, the morning gulls circling above the cliffs, the smell of salt and coffee filling my little room. My hands still ache when it rains, a reminder of years spent working for someone else's comfort. But there is no resentment in the pain, only memory. It's proof that I tried, that I gave all I had to give, even if the person who received it never saw its worth. Sometimes I catch myself talking aloud while I walk along the beach. Not to anyone, just to the wind. I tell it stories of the boy I raised, the man he became, the words that undid us both. The wind never answers, but somehow it listens. And that's enough. I've learned that love doesn't always end in a storm. Sometimes it ends in a whisper, in the slow turning of a doorknob, in the quiet folding of clothes into a suitcase, in the steady heartbeat of a man who decides to stop explaining himself. I didn't leave because I wanted to hurt him. I left because I finally understood that love without respect is slavery. And I had served long enough. I don't miss the house, though sometimes I dream of it. I see the garden at dusk, the faint glow of the porch light, the smell of rain on the windowsill. In those dreams, I'm always alone, standing by the gate, watching the shadows lengthen. It's strange. Even in memory, I never walk inside. Maybe that's how I know I made the right choice. Some doors are meant to stay closed. I wonder sometimes if he ever thinks of me, if he ever sits in silence and feels the weight of what he said. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. It doesn't matter anymore. I used to crave his apology, his understanding, his acknowledgement of everything I'd done. But the older I get, the more I realize, peace doesn't come from being understood. It comes from no longer needing to be. There are evenings when the sky burns red before night falls, and I think of him then, not with hatred, not even with sadness, just with a quiet kind of acceptance. He was never truly mine to keep. I was only a chapter in his story, the one that taught him what devotion looks like, even if he never learned to recognize it. That is enough for me. Sometimes the locals ask if I have family. I tell them I used to. They don't ask what happened, and I don't offer. I simply say, they're living their lives, and leave it at that. I don't tell them how much of mine was spent building theirs. I don't tell them how silence can feel heavier than grief. Those things belong to me now, and I guard them like treasures. If I have one regret, It's that I stayed too long trying to prove I belonged. But even that has its lesson. Love cannot be forced to bloom in soil that has turned cold. You can pour water forever, but it will never taste sweet again. Now, as I write these last lines by the window, the sea hums softly in the distance. I have no legacy, no inheritance to give. Only this truth. Peace is not something you find in others. It's something you build in the ruins of what they leave behind. Final thought. He told me I wasn't his real father. So I stopped pretending he was my real son. I sold the past, left the country, and became what he never expected. Free.